All right. So nice to be with you. Glad you're able to join this Tuesday afternoon. So wanted to talk today about this topic I've entitled "The Path to Freedom," but this is filling out a little bit some of the this structure that is known as the lamrim, or the stages of the path, and in particular last week's topic and this week's topic together. So the origins of suffering, the path to freedom, they together they create a full picture, a complete picture, known as the Four Noble Truths. But the basic idea is there is a wisdom that we can cultivate that has the illuminating power to dispel the darkness or confusion from our minds, and thus to dispel suffering and confusion. So it's a little bit a weak analogy, but children who are afraid of monsters under their bed, right? So one reliable technique, I think it's pretty reliable technique, is to then go with them and show them under the bed and see no monsters and no problem. Or in the closet, see, look, no monsters. You turn on the light and there is no more worry, no more fear to arise. So I talk a lot in these classes about the story that we tell, and that basically we are operating inside of the story. We're operating inside of our own story most all of the time. And sometimes it's interesting to sometimes meditation can be just sitting and just looking around and looking at your body, looking at the space around, just noticing, your breath or the feeling in your body. Or taking a walking meditation. One of the things that all of these do is they ground us in a physical reality, in a sense reality, as opposed to being caught up in our stories. Because what can happen with our personal story is that it can be incredibly dramatic, even if externally, it can be far more dramatic than the external circumstances might indicate. So, for example, I have a desk job. I sit at a computer all day. I am never at risk of violence or death in my job. There's never any physical threat. But depending on what the contents of an email might be, there's a bit more worry and fear and so forth arising. And we develop this stress response to non-physical things. We develop a stress response to the way people communicate to us. We develop a stress response to worries, concerns about what might happen in the future and so forth, just as if we were, there's a common story is told a lot, but just as if we were in physical danger, even though it's just a story in our minds. And in a sense, the deepest worries that we have, they deal with really seemingly intractable issues. Are we going to die? Are the people around us going to die? The answer is yes, and yes, of course we will. Will our life be meaningful? Well, it's very much depends on how you interpret that and how you think about that question, that problem. Some of these problems that we face feel intractable, like, can we solve? We look at the news. We have access to infinite information these days. We look at the news and there's endless bad things going on. Can we fix those problems ourselves directly? No, not directly, not ourselves. There's only a very small number of people in the world who might have leverage into the war in Ukraine or war in Ethiopia. And so there are problems that are seemingly unsolvable, but there is a way of solving our inner problem. And by which I mean finding peace and the peace to be able to go about our daily life, but also the peace to be able to work towards solutions if we have some practical ability to help or some leverage to help, a way to go about working in our daily lives without being overwhelmed, without being stressed, without being in conflict with others. And so when we talk about the path to freedom, that's what we're talking about. You may be familiar with this idea from I think it's, as far as I know, it's originally from Joseph Campbell, maybe not, but he analyzed all of these myths and stories that people have told throughout time, and he said that there's a very common narrative, this hero's journey. Right? One of the characteristics of the hero's journey is they set out on some great adventure, and they have, they face their own inner limitations, and they gradually overcome their own inner limitations. They go through all these challenges, but an inevitable aspect of this hero's journey is that they always come back home. But they come back home changed. And so, in a sense, they've gone on an external journey. They've gone to acquire something outside, but then they've ended up back in the same place that they started. But something's different, something's changed. Among many other things, I think that's a story about learning, right? Because in learning, with the learning process, um, the external world doesn't necessarily change, but our world, our personal world does change because we see it in a different way. We've gained new knowledge, we've gained a new understanding. So even old familiar places look very different with our new mind. This is one way of thinking about this hero's journey. Our mind changes through this path. The essential structure of the spiritual path, as I understand it, is like a hero's journey. It's a learning journey. It's a learning path whereby we are changing our mind, and we're basically ending up right back where we started, but with a new view, a new wisdom, a new understanding that sees through our problems. The particular path, now, while there's many different, and it's interesting, this term spiritual path. I mean, I'm just using this term spiritual path. It's the best, it's the most common way we describe this inner transformation. What do we mean when we say a spiritual path? Well, it means it's not exactly intellectual learning. It means we're learning at the heart level. We're learning at the level of what really motivates us at the deepest level. And traditionally people might call that spirit or something. But the idea of spirit, right? It's from this word for breath, I think it's Greek. What is the life force that motivates us? What is the deepest phenomenon that motivates us? And that's a very emotional aspect of our mind. It's a very deep aspect of our mind. When you're learning at an intellectual level, and to some degree, like in this class, for example, we are also learning at an intellectual level. When we learn at an intellectual level, you can deal with many, 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 many different things, very complicated and so forth. But when we're learning at a spiritual level, deep in our heart, we can't deal with a whole lot of complicated things, right? So spiritual learning is dealing with a simpler part of our mind, a more quiet, deep, emotionally focused part of our mind. My wife and I were discussing recently that sometimes, she was saying that sometimes when she meditates, she just feels like she's meditating on the most basic, most obvious basic things. But the point is, if you meditate and breathing meditation, for example, what could be more obvious or basic than that? Or, the thought, I am very fortunate, or the thought, others are very kind, or all of these are very basic truths, none of them very intellectually sophisticated. But our heart level, thinking at the level of our heart, we can't deal with a whole lot of sophistication, right? That's just not what that part of our mind does. That part of our mind deals with very basic, but very, very powerful truths. So in a spiritual path, what does this mean? Why do we use this analogy of path? So when you're walking on a physical path, if you go on a walk, sometimes we think of that as the world is out there and we move through it. We move through this world. But of course, I hope that these hand gestures are helpful for you to dramatize. This is in the absence of special effects. My special effects budget's very low. For instance, I don't even have props. Um, so if you go on a walk, which roughly looks like this, um, so one way to think about it, of course, is that you are moving through an external space, but that's not the way we experience it. The way we experience going for a walk is that our world changes one step at a time. We're always here, in a sense, but as you go on a walk, your world is changing. You're moving through space. So even something like physical movement, you can understand how we can see it in different ways. But so a path leads from one place to another place. An inner path leads from one inner state to another inner state. So a meditation is an example of an inner path. But in fact, any action that we do is an inner path. And so sometimes we talk about these inner pathways in the brain, these neural pathways. And one of the main neural pathways we've talked about is the neural pathway of habit forming. Habit forming just means making actions easier. Every time you do them, they become easier and easier and easier. And so you have to think less about these paths. What in effect we're doing is we're changing our inner state. I need to further develop my habit of exercising more regularly, for example. But in an inner path, you apply effort and your inner state changes. So, for example, you weren't feeling as good and then you feel better. In a meditation, for example, you can go from thinking, I'm very unfortunate, to contemplating the kindness of others, and you end up feeling very grateful. And you've changed your inner state. You've moved your mind from one state to another state. And this is what we mean by an inner path. So in this sense, any meditation is an inner path. Any action where we intentionally refrain from harming others, for example, it's an inner path. We're changing our mind, where we intentionally try to be generous to others, for example, or practice patience. All of these are inner paths. There's a part of us deep in our hearts that just kind of wants to solve all the problems, just like do something that will just solve all the problems. You know that feeling, like, oh, if I could just do this, then all my problems would be solved, right? If I could just get this new job, then I just got a new job. So don't tell anybody this, but I've got a new job soon. But I think, oh, if I could just get this new job, all my problems will be solved. And then now I'm starting to think about this new job. And of course I'm thinking, this is going to be hard. So of course, what you get is a new set of problems. Every time your life changes, you get a new, different set of problems. So even though our mind is thinking there should be some way to just solve all these problems, to just feel better, to just feel at peace, at ease, that's not our experience normally. But there is a way in which it could be. There is a special path, and this is a unique. As far as I know, it's as far as I know, this is a teaching that is unique to the Buddhist tradition. But how to permanently solve our problems by recognizing, by understanding the nature of ourself in a different way. So, for example, even on a simple level, if we're thinking, oh, I'm so unfortunate, my life's so hard, my life's so difficult, and then we go through a line of thinking about the kindness of others and our good fortune, and then we come to the conclusion, I never was unfortunate. I never was. I thought I was unfortunate, but I never was. Think about that. You thought you were unfortunate. You thought you were an unfortunate person. You, the unfortunate person, do not exist. I'm not saying what does exist, but we'll just say you, the unfortunate person, that unfortunate person doesn't exist. You as an incapable person don't exist. You as a powerless person don't exist. You as a person who can't change your mind don't exist. And it's a bit of a subtlety, right? But in a sense, what we're doing is we're making a concept of ourselves disappear. We're just like, no. And going back to looking under the bed for that monster in the dark, and then you don't see a monster under the bed, and you're like, oh, well, that's much better. That should be the reaction of a child, a wise child. Their parents show them there's no monster under the bed. They should experience relief. Oh, fantastic. And then you check the closet. There's no monster in the closet. There's no monster anywhere. Look, no monsters. All right, let's go to bed. This is the meaning of finding permanent freedom, is recognizing that the person who we think we are, who experiences this endless array of problems and disappointments and limitations and frustrations and so forth, that person has never existed. Now, what does exist, I don't know. Actually, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that much. What matters is the way we've been thinking about ourselves is problematic. It is literally a source of problems. That's what we mean when we say problematic. So you have a problem. We have a problematic way of thinking about ourselves, and it's not your fault. It's innate. It's instinctive. Even every animal does as well. Like, it's hard. It's hard to have a mind. There's not that many living beings on Earth that have minds, right? Plants, I don't know. Plants can adapt. I don't think they have minds exactly. Living beings, animals and so forth, they have minds. Humans have fairly sophisticated minds, but it doesn't mean that our minds are perceiving reality, right? Perceiving anything is hard, right? Perceiving the actual truth, to say that I actually know what's going on, I actually know who I am, what I am. That's a bit of that's an exaggeration. We see things and then we assume that we are seeing the actual truth. We always mistake our perception and our opinion for the truth. Now, you know people who believe that they know the truth, but you know that they're wrong, right? So you probably know entire political parties who believe that they know the truth, but you know that they're wrong, right? There's hundreds of millions of people who you're sure that they're wrong, right? And there's all kinds of people who are uneducated about this and that, and you just sort of count up the people who are uneducated about various things. We have confidence in the end. And for example, your spouse or your partner, your friends, whatever, do you have things where you know that they're wrong? Are there any areas where you are sure, completely sure that they are wrong? In the end, if we look carefully, we'll find that if we spend enough time talking to people, we'll always find that in one way or another, they're all wrong. Everybody else is wrong. The only person we'll be left with believing that they're not wrong is ourselves. Now, here's the tricky part, is that everybody else in the world looks at us and they know that we're wrong. You know, we may not believe them, right? So it's impossible for us to be right. We're all wrong. Everybody's wrong. From the point of view of physics, so I have a certain opinion of who I am. Like, I'm like this and I do this. And so from the point of view of physics, that's not who I am. From the point of view of physics, I have mass and heat and so forth. But the view of me from the point of view of physics, utterly unlike my view of myself. The view of me from the point of view of history, right? I'm just some insignificant, dot statistic in the view of history. The view of me from the point of view of psychology, psychologists who really got to know my mind. They would look at all of these, unconscious biases and influences from my parents and society, and from the point of view of biology, from the point of view of any scientific discipline, looking at ourselves, none of those match our own perspective and opinion of ourselves. But yet we still think we know who we are, and we still believe that we know what our problems are. We still believe that we know if we're capable or incapable, or fortunate or unfortunate, or powerless or powerful, and so forth. And so this path to freedom is a learning journey in which we look at ourselves, look deeply into our hearts, look deeply into our mind, into our body, and we realize that person that I thought I was, person doesn't exist, and therefore their problems don't exist. But this is a path because it takes some wisdom, takes some understanding, takes some contemplation. So I've given some instructions, guided here, but this is something where we need to spend some time pondering this ourselves. So what I'll do is I'll guide some meditation on this topic. And what we can do is that we've done this meditation before, but we look at, we bring to mind our problems, whatever's on our mind today, because whatever's on our mind typically ties into some problem we have. And then we will look at what that implies about how we see ourselves. So for example, seeing ourselves as an unfortunate person, or a powerless person, whatever. So we figure out how we see ourselves, and then we can question that, look at that from different points of view, and then we think, is that actually who I am? And then meditate on if we discover that how we see ourselves is perhaps not accurate, then we meditate on that. The experience of this is the experience of relief, right? Well, it could be a variety of experiences, but largely it's the experience of relief. It's similar to, being diagnosed with an illness and then discovering that actually it was a wrong diagnosis. You didn't have that disease at all, and so some feeling of relief arising. But okay. So hopefully this gives you some sense. But what we can do is we can go through this meditation together, and I'll guide us through this process. So we can begin as usual just by closing our eyes to limit distraction, sitting upright and taking a deep breath in and out. Then another breath, just inviting ourselves to relax. And another breath, asking ourselves what is important right now. So we can begin by spending a bit of time just experiencing our body to settle our mind, just feeling each breath. And then we can just ask, what is on our mind? Typically, we'll be chewing on something, pondering something, some problem or challenge. And we don't worry too much about the circumstances or details of the problem, but we ask ourselves, how do we just notice how we feel in that situation? Perhaps even feeling in our body. And then thinking about this situation or problem that we find ourselves in, we just try to gently notice what does this imply about how we see ourselves? How do we see ourselves in that situation? Do you see yourself as vulnerable or powerless or feel unfortunate, for example, or just substitute your own words. What's the essence of how we see ourselves in the center of this problem? Just spend a little while trying to get to know or identify this self that is at the center of our story in this problem. can begin gently to question that self. Does that person really exist the way we see ourselves? Are we always, for example, powerless? Are we always vulnerable? Maybe we regard ourselves as immensely important. Does everybody else see us as so important? Are we actually that important? If this version of ourself was true, then at all times, in all situations, that's actually what we would be. Vulnerable or powerless or extremely important or whatever it is that we see ourselves. Clearly, that version of ourself can't exist, has never existed. It's just a story. If we get distracted, our mind's wandering, we go back through this exercise, remembering the problem, looking at how we see ourselves, questioning or doubting the reality of that self, seeing through that self, imagining it disappear, and experiencing a sense of relief or freedom. then we can bring to mind our family, friends, colleagues, co-workers, all the people who've touched and influenced our life. And we can think they're all trapped in their own stories, trapped in their own concepts of who they are, what kind of world they live in, what they're capable of. We develop a strong wish, may they all be permanently free by realizing that those stories are not the truth. And then we can finally think through this brief time here. We have changed our mind. We have followed internal pathways. To some degree, we have had clarity and concentration. To some degree, perhaps confusion or distraction. But nevertheless, just coming here, trying to see through this story that we're trapped in. We have created very, very powerful potentials in our mind. The entire foundations for our problems have been shaken. So we just feel very, very pleased and proud of ourselves for having done the meditation, and develop a wish to help everyone to follow these same paths in future. And as we emerge from our meditation, we can go about our daily life just knowing that we are operating in a story, that we are constantly casting a spell over ourselves, our own mind casting a spell over ourselves. But remember that we can see through this to freedom. And then we can open our eyes and our eyes from our meditation.